In November 2019, I was deployed to Antarctica for a weather station that wasn't measuring weather. What we found beneath the ice changed everything I thought I knew about human history. My name is Lieutenant William Ashcroft, and I've accepted what's going to happen to me for telling this story. The orders came on a Friday afternoon, via courier, never a good sign. Military communications have procedures, chain of command, digital paper trails. When they're hand-delivered, it means someone doesn't want an electronic record. The courier was civilian, mid-40s, forgettable face, the kind you'd walk past without noticing. He handed me a manila envelope, my name printed in generic computer font, no return address, no official markings. Lieutenant Ashcroft, he said, voice flat, professional. Report to Andrews Air Force Base Monday morning. Bring cold weather gear. Extended deployment. No communication with family about this assignment. Before I could ask questions, he was gone. Inside was a single page. Deployment orders to McMurdo Station, Antarctica. Meteorological support operations. Duration indefinite. The equipment list told me this wasn't about weather. Portable encryption devices. Tactical gear. Military hardware disguised as scientific equipment. I've been on classified operations before. Missions where the official story bore no resemblance to reality. But this felt different. This felt like being disappeared with official paperwork. My wife, Jennifer, knew something was wrong. 20 years of marriage means you can't hide much. How long, she asked. Indefinite, I said. Could be weeks. Could be longer. She'd already guessed from my equipment. Antarctica. I nodded. Meteorological support. She'd seen me deploy to combat zones before. But something about this assignment made her more worried than usual. Just come back, she said. Whatever this is, just make sure you come back. I promised I would. The way deployed soldiers always promise. We both knew it was a promise I might not be able to keep. Monday morning, I reported to Andrews. Building C7. Windowless briefing room that smelled like fresh paint and institutional coffee. 3 other personnel were waiting. Senior Master Sergeant Henry Beaumont. Career military. Late 30s. Weathered face from years of harsh deployments. 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen things civilian therapists couldn't process. Specialist Elliot Pembroke. Younger. Late 20s. Soft hands. Nervous energy. Radar technician with advanced degrees in atmospheric physics, the kind of specialist recruited when technical expertise mattered more than combat experience. Petty Officer Samuel Rothwell. Navy logistics. Background in supply chain management. He had the organized demeanor of someone who'd spent years making sure equipment ended up in the right places. Also the kind of person you noticed when supplies didn't match missions. We introduced ourselves. Minimal courtesy. Names, ranks, specialties. Nothing personal. Nothing that would create emotional attachments if things went sideways. The briefing officer arrived exactly on time. Major Caldwell, though something about him suggested the rank might be courtesy rather than actual position. He had bland, forgettable features, selected specifically for the ability to blend into backgrounds. Gentlemen, he said, what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. This operation does not officially exist. Upon completion, you will not discuss any aspect with anyone. Is this understood? We nodded. He opened his briefcase, pulled out 4 identical folders. Your deployment is to a research facility in Antarctica, officially designated Outpost Meridian. On paper, this is a joint military-civilian meteorological station. That cover story is what you'll use if questioned. The projector displayed satellite imagery. Antarctica's vast white expanse. He zoomed in on a location several hundred kilometers from McMurdo. Outpost Meridian is here, one of the most remote and hostile environments on Earth. Surface temperature averages -40 Celsius. Winds regularly exceed 60 miles per hour. Rescue operations would be difficult, if not impossible. The satellite images showed prefabricated buildings, central structures surrounded by smaller modules, standard Antarctic base configuration, except for one detail. Those are guard towers, I said, pointing to structures at the perimeter, hardened defensive positions. Caldwell didn't confirm or deny, just moved to the next slide. The facility has enhanced security protocols. Your role is to maintain operational security, manage logistics, provide technical support. Standard tour is 6 months. Beaumont raised his hand. Sir, what exactly is the research we're protecting? Weather stations don't typically require defensive positions. The look on Caldwell's face told me he'd expected this question, had prepared a non-answer. The specifics are classified above your clearance level. Outpost Meridian conducts atmospheric monitoring with national security implications. Your job is not to understand the research, just ensure it continues without interruption. Military speak for not telling you anything. Just do your job, don't ask questions. But the fact they needed security personnel for a weather station suggested the research wasn't atmospheric at all. The briefing continued for another hour. Deployment procedures, communication protocols, emergency evacuation scenarios, everything delivered in bland bureaucratic language. But certain details stood out. Radio communications strictly controlled and monitored. Personal communications with family limited to pre-approved text transmissions, screened by facility security. No phone calls, no video, no unmonitored contact with the outside world. Supply shipments occurred monthly, weather permitting, but cargo manifests were classified. Our job was to receive and catalog supplies, not to question discrepancies between manifests and actual deliveries. Personnel were divided into 2 categories: research staff with full access, support staff with restricted access to designated zones only. We would be support staff. Large portions of the facility would be off limits despite our security clearances. The most disturbing part was the psychological screening. All personnel underwent evaluation, signed documentation, acknowledging that exposure to certain operational conditions might result in mental stress, requiring specialized debriefing upon return. What kind of weather research caused psychological trauma? Your transport departs at 1800 hours, Caldwell said. You'll fly to Christchurch, New Zealand, then transfer to military transport for the final leg. Total travel time approximately 36 hours. Any questions? We had questions, but none that would get answered in a briefing room at Andrews. After Caldwell left, we remained in the room, studying materials, trying to read between the lines. Anyone else notice the evacuation protocols? Rothwell said. Flipping through his folder, standard Antarctic operations have detailed rescue procedures, international coordination, clear chains of command. These protocols are minimal, almost like they're designed to discourage evacuation requests. He was right. The evacuation procedures were perfunctory. Personnel at Outpost Meridian were expected to handle emergencies independently. Pembroke studied the facility diagrams. The power requirements are excessive for a weather station. Based on these generator specifications and fuel storage, they're running industrial-level equipment. Whatever they're doing, it's not just measuring wind speed. Beaumont had been quiet. Now he spoke with careful deliberation. I've deployed to classified facilities before, weapons testing ranges, intelligence stations. This feels different, like they're hiding something beyond normal classification protocols. The flight to New Zealand was long, uncomfortable, giving us time to study briefing materials, speculate about what we were walking into. The final leg from Christchurch was on a C-130 Hercules, same rugged military transport that had been flying to the ice for decades. No windows, no comfort, canvas seats and cargo netting. The crew chief gave us the standard briefing without enthusiasm. Gentlemen, we'll be landing at Outpost Meridian in approximately 7 hours. Current ground temperature -42°C, winds gusting to 55 miles per hour. Visibility variable due to blowing snow. We'll have 10 minutes on the ground for offload before returning to McMurdo. Questions? Nobody asked questions. We were going to one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Questions wouldn't change that. As the C-130 descended, I stared through the small porthole window. Endless white ice stretched every horizon. Somewhere down there was Outpost Meridian, and whatever secrets it contained. The landing was rough, controlled crash when conditions don't allow smooth touchdowns. When the cargo door opened, Antarctic air hit like a physical force. I'd been cold before, Alaska, Northern Europe, but this was different. This was cold that wanted to kill you. They found every gap in your clothing and started working to shut down your body's systems. Personnel from the facility met us at the landing zone, bundled in extreme cold weather gear. Arctic astronauts. They worked efficiently, unloading cargo, directing us toward a tracked vehicle. No greetings, no welcome speeches, just professional efficiency. As we climbed into the vehicle, I caught my first clear view of Outpost Meridian through blowing snow. Prefabricated buildings and defensive perimeter, satellite arrays, communication equipment, excessive for a weather station. And yes, guard towers with hardened defensive positions. Whatever we were here to protect was worth defending with military force in one of the most remote locations on Earth. The tracked vehicle carried us through the Antarctic wasteland. As we approached, I noticed the first truly disturbing detail. The perimeter fence wasn't designed to keep people out. The angles of the barriers, the configuration of the defensive positions. Everything suggested it was designed to contain something, rather than protect against external threats. We weren't here to defend a research station from outside attack. We were here to make sure whatever was inside never got out. The interior was surprisingly spacious. The main facility consisted of interconnected modules around a central hub, worn of corridors and chambers extending deeper into the ice than the surface suggested. Everything painted institutional white and gray. Exposed pipes and conduits along ceilings. Our orientation was conducted by Dr. Veronica Strand. Severe woman in her early 50s, controlled demeanor suggesting military background despite civilian credentials. Outpost Meridian operates under strict compartmentalization, she said, leading us through corridors that seem to extend far deeper than diagrams indicated. Research staff have access based on clearances. Support personnel have access to designated zones only. This is not negotiable. Violation will result in immediate disciplinary action. The common areas were what you'd expect. Mess hall, recreation room, dormitory modules, everything designed for function, not comfort. Built to support personnel in extreme isolation. But as we moved deeper, certain details stood out. Security cameras every 20 feet, far more surveillance than necessary. Some doors marked with biometric access panels, suggesting compartmentalized sections requiring highest clearance. Deeper sections had reinforced construction, walls thicker than normal, doors that sealed with pressure locks. Your primary duties involve logistics management and equipment maintenance. Dr. Strand continued. Supply manifests arrived digitally prior to cargo shipments. Your job is to receive materials, catalog items according to classification protocols, distribute supplies to appropriate departments. Questions about manifest contents should be directed to facility security. Don't ask what we're doing with the equipment. Our duty stations were in a logistics section, connected rooms filled with inventory systems. Rothwell immediately began familiarizing himself with cataloging procedures. I started reviewing previous month's manifests. The manifests were strange. Standard operations require fuel, food, medical supplies, equipment maintenance materials. Outpost Meridian received all that, but also unusual quantities of electronic components, specialized drilling equipment, materials more appropriate for industrial construction than meteorological research. One manifest listed geophysical survey equipment, ground-penetrating radar systems powerful enough to scan several kilometers into the ice sheet. Another showed atmospheric sampling apparatus that looked more like vacuum containment systems. Several recent shipments contained biological containment equipment rated for hazardous organic materials. What kind of weather research required biological containment? Beaumont was assigned to security operations. After initial orientation, he returned looking disturbed. The security procedures are excessive, he said quietly, making sure Dr. Strand had left. Armed patrols, motion sensors, surveillance appropriate for weapons research or intelligence stations. For a weather station, this makes no sense. Pembroke was assigned to communications and radar systems. When he returned, he was confused. The radar equipment isn't designed for weather monitoring, he said, voice low. These are deep scanning systems for geological surveys, underground mapping, and they're pointed down into the ice sheet, not up at the atmosphere. Whatever they're studying, it's not weather patterns. Over the next few weeks, we settled into routines, trying to piece together what Outpost Meridian was really doing. The official story was atmospheric research, but everything contradicted that cover. Research staff kept to themselves, maintaining professional distance from support personnel. Most had advanced degrees in fields that had nothing to do with meteorology, geophysics, archaeology, xenobiology, theoretical physics. They worked in restricted sections, areas requiring biometric access and clearances we didn't possess. When they emerged for meals, they had distracted, exhausted demeanor, people working on problems that consumed all their mental energy. Dr. James Haraman was the lead researcher, brilliant geophysicist in his early 60s, disheveled appearance, someone who cared more about his work than personal grooming. He rarely interacted with support staff, but when he did, there was intensity in his eyes, obsession rather than professional dedication. The kind that comes from discovering something that challenges everything you thought you knew. The restricted sections were the real mystery. Almost half the facility was off limits. Sealed behind reinforced doors with biometric controls, we could see research staff coming and going at all hours, carrying equipment that didn't match meteorological research. Sealed containers labeled with biohazard symbols. Core samples dripping with preservative fluids. Electronic equipment humming with excessive power consumption. But the most disturbing discovery came during our second week. Rothwell noticed discrepancies in supply manifests. "Look at these fuel consumption figures," he said, showing me inventory reports from previous 6 months. The facility's power generation and heating requirements should consume approximately 12,000 gallons monthly, but we're receiving 20,000 gallons, and storage tanks are never more than half full. Where's the excess fuel going? Good question. 8,000 gallons per month was enough to power significant operations beyond what a research station required. They were running equipment not listed in official documentation, or conducting activities requiring industrial-level energy consumption. I started paying closer attention to facility rhythms, noting patterns that didn't match normal research operations. The restricted sections had heightened activity during night hours, when most personnel were supposed to be sleeping. Equipment deliveries sometimes occurred at unusual times. Cargo containers moved directly to restricted areas without normal inventory procedures, and several times I noticed research staff emerging from restricted sections looking shaken, as if they'd encountered something disturbing on a fundamental level. Beaumont made the next discovery during security rounds. "The defensive positions aren't just guard towers," he said. "When we met privately, they're equipped with weapon systems designed for area denial, heavy machine guns, automated surveillance, non-lethal deterrent equipment that could create barriers preventing movement in or out. These aren't defensive positions, they're containment measures. Someone designed this to prevent something from leaving, not to protect against external threats. Whatever they're researching, there's concern it might try to escape." The implications were disturbing. What kind of meteorological research required containment measures designed to prevent escape? Pembroke's work revealed more pieces. "The satellite uplinks aren't just for normal research data," he said. "The facility has dedicated encrypted channels on frequencies reserved for highest-level military communications, direct links to command authorities outside normal scientific chains, and the data streams from restricted sections are massive. Terabytes transmitted daily to locations not identified in communication logs. Whatever research they're conducting, it's generating enough data to fill entire server farms." As weeks passed, we pieced together a picture that grew increasingly disturbing. This wasn't a weather station. This was a classified military operation conducting underground exploration or excavation, studying something buried beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, requiring extreme security measures and biological containment protocols. But what could be buried under miles of ice justifying this level of secrecy and resources? The answer began to reveal itself through small incidents. Research staff occasionally made comments that slipped past usual discretion. Equipment being moved through common areas sometimes showed labels contradicting the atmospheric research cover. And sounds we heard from restricted sections suggested industrial operations rather than laboratory work. Late one night, conducting routine inventory, I heard something that made me stop. It came from deep within the facility, from sections extending far below surface modules. A low rumbling vibration. like heavy machinery or drilling equipment operating at depth. When I checked with facility management, I was told all drilling operations had been suspended weeks ago due to equipment maintenance. So what was making that sound? Beaumont started mapping the facility's actual layout. Comparing what we could observe with official diagrams, what he discovered was disturbing. The facility extends much deeper than documentation indicates, he said, showing me notes he'd been keeping. The restricted sections aren't just sealed laboratories. They're entrance points to underground tunnels descending far below surface installation. I've been tracking personnel movements. Research staff sometimes disappear into restricted sections for 12 to 18 hours. They're not just working in laboratories. They're going somewhere deep underground, conducting operations requiring extended deployment into whatever they found beneath the ice. The final piece came during our 4th week. A supply shipment arrived that hadn't been listed on any manifest. Cargo containers transferred directly to restricted sections without normal inventory procedures, but not before I caught a glimpse through a partially opened crate. Excavation equipment, industrial-grade drilling apparatus, biological containment suits rated for extreme hazardous material exposure, and sealed containers labeled with symbols I recognized from advanced weapons research programs. This wasn't research equipment. This was equipment for handling something dangerous, something requiring the same precautions used with weapons-grade biological or chemical agents. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. Facility security was designed to prevent unauthorized access to restricted sections, but years of military logistics had taught me every security system has vulnerabilities, areas where surveillance is imperfect, times when guard rotations create gaps, access points that bypass official checkpoints. I needed to see what was happening in those restricted sections. I needed to understand what justified this level of secrecy and security. Using knowledge from weeks of observation, I identified a maintenance access corridor connecting logistics to a restricted zone. Late at night during shift change, when surveillance focused on main access points, I slipped through that corridor, entered areas where I had no authorization. The restricted section was nothing like the rest of the facility. Where common areas were institutional and sterile, this section had been retrofitted with heavy reinforcement, industrial equipment suggesting serious construction rather than laboratory work. Thick power cables ran along the ceiling, feeding equipment that hummed with massive energy consumption. The air smelled different, mineral-rich and slightly metallic, like deep underground rather than surface installation. Following the main corridor deeper, I found what appeared to be entrance to an underground shaft. Heavy-duty elevators descended into darkness far below, control panels showing depth markers that went down hundreds of meters into the ice sheet. They weren't just studying something buried beneath the ice, they were excavating it, digging deep into the Antarctic ice sheet to reach something sealed away for unknown ages. As I stood staring into that dark shaft, I heard voices approaching, research staff returning from deep below, their conversation audible as they emerged from the elevator. The latest core samples show the structure extends much deeper than initial surveys indicated, a woman's voice said. Tired and strained, Dr. Haraman estimates we're still at least 50 meters from the main chamber, but acoustic readings suggest something massive down there, something that was deliberately buried and sealed. The dating analysis doesn't make sense, a man responded. The ice layer immediately above the structure is approximately 12,000 years old, consistent with the end of the last ice age, but the structure itself is showing dating inconsistencies, suggesting it's far older. Either our equipment is malfunctioning or we found something that predates any known human civilization by tens of thousands of years. I pressed into shadows as they passed, but their conversation continued. What concerns me most are the thermal readings, the woman said. Something at that depth should be frozen solid, but we're detecting temperature variations suggesting residual warmth, as if whatever is down there is somehow generating heat, maintaining itself against the cold. That shouldn't be possible. They disappeared into another section before I could hear more. But what I'd learned was enough. They had found something buried deep beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. Something ancient, something predating known human civilization. Something still generating heat, despite being sealed under miles of ice for thousands of years. And instead of reporting this to international scientific authorities, military command had decided to conduct a classified excavation, studying whatever they'd found in complete secrecy. The question was, what had they found? And more importantly, why did it require biological containment protocols and security measures designed to prevent escape? I needed to know more, but returning to unauthorized sections would be too risky. Security staff would eventually review surveillance footage, notice my presence in restricted areas. I had to be careful, patient, gathering information through observation rather than direct investigation. Over the following weeks, I paid close attention to every detail. Pattern of research staff movements, timing of equipment deliveries, changes in facility atmosphere suggesting major developments in the excavation. Slowly, a picture emerged of something far more disturbing than simple archaeological discovery. The excavation was accelerating. Equipment deliveries increased in frequency and urgency. Research staff looked increasingly stressed, working longer hours with less rest. Conversations I overheard suggested they were approaching something significant, reaching depths or making discoveries with implications beyond mere scientific curiosity. Dr. Haraman began conducting private briefings with select research staff. Meetings held in shielded rooms where electronic surveillance was disabled. The fact that facility leadership felt the need to avoid their own security systems suggested discoveries were sensitive enough to require extreme confidentiality. Even from command authorities who'd authorized the operation, something was very wrong at Outpost Meridian, something beyond classified research or military secrecy, and the growing tension among research staff suggested whatever they were finding beneath the ice was not what they'd expected to discover. The breaking point came during our 8th week, when everything changed in ways that would make denial impossible and secrecy unsustainable. The change began subtly. Small deviations from normal operations most personnel wouldn't notice unless they'd been paying close attention for weeks. Research staff who'd maintained professional composure began showing signs of stress beyond normal work fatigue. Behavioral changes appeared. Sleep disturbances, arguments during meals, incidents of researchers refusing to return to deep sections for reasons they wouldn't explain. Medical staff reported increasing requests for anxiety medication and sleep aids, noting that personnel who'd had direct contact with recent excavation sites were experiencing psychological effects that standard treatment protocols couldn't address. Pembroke noticed changes in communication patterns first. The encrypted data streams show irregular patterns, he told me, during private conversation. Bursts of massive information transmission, followed by complete communication blackouts. Satellite uplinks operating at maximum capacity during these bursts, transmitting volumes, suggesting something significant has been discovered. The communication protocols have changed. Whatever they found, they're reporting it to command authorities in real time now. No more regular scheduled transmissions. This is continuous streaming of data and video feeds, like they want outside observers to see exactly what's happening as it happens, which suggested command authorities were concerned enough about developments that they wanted immediate awareness rather than periodic updates. Rothwell noticed changes in supply patterns even more disturbing. Emergency requisitions for specialized equipment, he said, showing me manifests he'd managed to document before they were classified. Arriving on unscheduled flights. Materials bypassing normal inventory procedures going directly to restricted sections. Biological containment equipment. Advanced scanning systems. What appears to be emergency evacuation gear rated for hazmat conditions. They're preparing for contingencies. Evacuation protocols. Containment measures. Sterilization equipment. The kind of materials you'd use if you needed to seal something dangerous and evacuate personnel on short notice. Beaumont's security observations painted an even more alarming picture. The defensive positions at the perimeter have been reinforced with additional automated systems, he said after observing drills. Emergency protocols updated to include scenarios not explained in any official documentation. Security staff conducting drills involving facility-wide lockdowns and rapid response procedures designed for internal threats rather than external attacks. Something has them spooked. Security protocols designed for containment are being upgraded to include active suppression measures. They're preparing to deal with something that might try to escape, and they want capability to stop it with lethal force if necessary. The final warning came during our 9th week. Dr. Nan, Armin called an emergency meeting of all facility personnel. The fact he was including support staff in a briefing suggested the situation had deteriorated. Maintaining complete compartmentalization was no longer possible. We assembled in the main briefing room, research staff and support personnel together for the first time since initial orientation. The tension was palpable. Research staff looked exhausted and stressed. Support personnel confused about why normal protocols were being violated. Dr. Haraman stood at the front with strained demeanor, someone delivering news he'd rather not share. "I want to thank everyone for your dedicated service to this operation," he began. "Your work has been instrumental in advancing our understanding of Antarctic geology and atmospheric conditions." The official cover story, delivered in a tone suggesting nobody believed it anymore. "However," he continued, "recent developments in our research have created situations requiring enhanced facility protocols. Effective immediately, all personnel should familiarize themselves with emergency evacuation procedures. Support staff may be temporarily restricted from certain sections while we address equipment malfunctions that have created minor safety concerns." Equipment malfunctions. That was the official explanation for why research staff showed signs of psychological trauma, and facility security was being upgraded to military combat standards. After the briefing, whispered conversations among research staff revealed fragments of truth official statements couldn't contain. I positioned myself near groups of researchers during meals, listening to conversations they thought were private. "The structure is larger than anything we anticipated," one researcher said quietly. "Acoustic mapping suggests it extends for kilometers beneath the ice sheet. Whatever built this possessed capabilities far beyond any known prehistoric civilization." "That's not what concerns me," another responded. "What concerns me is evidence of recent activity, temperature readings, chemical analysis of interior atmosphere, signs suggesting whatever is down there isn't completely dormant. We may have disturbed something that was intentionally sealed for reasons we don't understand." The conversations painted a picture of discoveries challenging fundamental assumptions about human history and Antarctic geology. They had found architectural remains of a civilization that existed before any known human culture, buried beneath ice sheets dating to the end of the last ice age. Structures showing advanced engineering and construction techniques that shouldn't have been possible for prehistoric societies. And most disturbing, evidence suggesting these structures weren't completely inactive, that something about their excavation had triggered responses, indicating preservation systems or defensive measures that remained functional after thousands of years. I needed to see it for myself. Whatever they'd found beneath the ice, whatever was causing this level of concern, I needed to witness it directly to understand the full scope of what we were dealing with. The opportunity came during a shift rotation when security procedures focused on monitoring research staff movements rather than support personnel activities. Using the same maintenance corridor I discovered weeks earlier, I accessed restricted sections, made my way to the underground shaft. The elevator descent took several minutes. Control panel showing depth markers passing 200 meters, then 300, descending far deeper than surface facilities suggested. When the elevator finally stopped and doors opened, I stepped into an environment that bore no resemblance to anything I'd expected. This wasn't a natural ice cave or simple excavation. This was constructed space. Tunnels carved through solid ice with precision suggesting advanced equipment and sophisticated engineering. Walls smooth and reinforced with support structures, installed by research teams to stabilize excavation sites. Power cables and lighting systems ran along the ceiling, providing illumination for corridors extending in multiple directions. Following the main tunnel, I descended further into excavation zones, where recent work was evident. Fresh ice walls where drilling equipment had carved new passages, equipment stations where researchers had set up monitoring systems. Sealed doorways marked with biohazard warnings leading to deeper sections requiring specialized protective gear. The temperature was rising the deeper I went. Not dramatically, but enough to notice. Surface temperature in Antarctica was -40 Celsius, but down here in sealed tunnels, several hundred meters below the ice sheet, it felt closer to freezing rather than extreme cold. Something was generating heat at depth, warming the immediate environment against the surrounding glacial ice. As I moved deeper, I began to notice details that made my skin crawl. The ice walls showed patterns that looked almost deliberate, shapes and curves suggesting design rather than natural formation. In several places, darker material was visible through the ice, structured forms that had been exposed by excavation, then quickly sealed again, as if researchers had decided they didn't want to fully uncover what they'd found. The main excavation chamber was massive, easily the size of an airplane hangar. Carved from solid ice with industrial equipment that must have taken months of continuous operation, scaffolding and work platforms provided access to different levels. Powerful lights illuminated what research teams had uncovered at the center of the space. I stopped at the entrance trying to process what I was seeing. At the heart of the excavation was a structure that shouldn't exist. Not a building in any conventional sense, but a massive architectural form carved from dark material that looked like stone but reflected light in ways suggesting metallic properties. The construction was geometric but alien, following design principles that didn't match any architectural tradition I'd ever seen, angles that seemed wrong, proportions that created optical illusions, making it difficult to judge size and distance, surface details that looked almost organic, despite clearly being carved or constructed by intelligent beings. The structure rose from the excavation floor like a cathedral designed by something that had never encountered human architecture. Towers and buttresses curved in impossible directions, creating forms that hurt to look at directly because they violated expectations about how three-dimensional objects should exist in physical space. The surface was covered in intricate patterns and inscriptions, symbols that looked almost familiar but conveyed no meaning that human minds could process. Research equipment surrounded the structure, scanning systems analyzing composition and internal structure. Atmospheric monitors measuring chemical properties of air within sealed chambers. Thermal imaging systems showing heat signatures confirming something inside was generating warmth. I stood there frozen, trying to comprehend what I was witnessing. This wasn't geological formation or natural structure. This was architecture, deliberate construction by intelligence that possessed capabilities far beyond anything in prehistoric human civilization. And it had been buried beneath Antarctic ice for thousands of years, possibly tens of thousands, sealed away from the surface world for reasons that became increasingly ominous the longer I stared at it. Movement in my peripheral vision snapped me back to immediate reality. Research staff were approaching the chamber from another tunnel. If they discovered me here without authorization, the consequences would be severe. I retreated quickly, making my way back to the elevator, ascending to surface levels before security systems could identify my presence in restricted zones. My heart was pounding, not from physical exertion, but from knowledge of what I'd seen. They had found evidence of a prehistoric civilization in Antarctica, buried beneath ice sheets dating to the end of the last ice age, a civilization that possessed architectural and engineering capabilities challenging everything we thought we knew about human development. And instead of sharing this discovery with international scientific authorities, military command had decided to conduct classified excavation and study in complete secrecy. Why? What was so dangerous or sensitive about this discovery that it required military-level security and biological containment protocols? The answer came 3 days later when everything at Outpost Meridian changed in ways that made secrecy impossible and denial futile. I was conducting routine inventory work in the logistics section when alarms began sounding throughout the facility. Not fire alarms or standard emergency signals, but specialized alerts I'd heard only during security drills. Facility-wide lockdown protocols, activating all automated systems simultaneously. All personnel report to designated safe zones immediately, Dr. Strand's voice announced over facility intercom. This is not a drill. Repeat. This is not a drill. Repeat. This is not a drill. All personnel to safe zones now. The tone was controlled but urgent, carrying undertones of genuine concern rather than routine procedure. Beaumont appeared in the logistics section within seconds, his training evident in the way he moved with purposeful efficiency. Something happened in the deep excavation zones, he said. Security channels are reporting containment breach and evacuation of research personnel from underground sections. Containment breach. The word sent ice through my veins colder than Antarctic air. We made our way to designated safe zones as ordered, but through windows and corridor walls, I could see activity confirming Beaumont's assessment. Research staff emerging from restricted sections, some walking quickly with barely controlled panic, others being supported by colleagues as if physically injured or psychologically traumatized. Medical staff rushed to treat personnel showing signs of shock and exposure to conditions that shouldn't exist in sealed excavation chambers. The lockdown lasted 4 hours, during which official information was minimal, and rumors spread through support personnel like wildfire. Something had happened in deep excavation zones. Researchers had been evacuated, containment protocols activated to seal underground sections, when lockdown was finally lifted and we were allowed to return to normal duties. The atmosphere at Outpost Meridian had changed fundamentally. Research staff who'd emerged from deep sections were being quarantined, observed by medical personnel. Security patrols had doubled. Armed personnel stationed at every entrance to restricted zones, and facility management was conducting emergency briefings with senior research staff behind sealed doors that even surveillance systems couldn't penetrate. I found Pembroke in the communications section looking shaken by data streams he'd been monitoring during the lockdown. The amount of information transmitted during the incident was massive, he said quietly. Real-time video feeds, biological monitoring data, structural analysis of excavation sites. They were streaming everything directly to command authorities as it happened, like they wanted immediate external awareness of whatever occurred down there. Rothwell had discovered that emergency supply requisitions had been filed for materials suggesting serious containment measures, industrial sealants, atmospheric sterilization equipment, and what looks like preparations for permanent closure of excavation sites. They're going to seal it, Rothwell said, showing me classified requisition codes he'd managed to document. Whatever they found, whatever happened during that breach, they've decided it's too dangerous to continue excavation. They're preparing to fill excavation chambers with concrete and abandon the entire operation, which meant whatever had caused the containment breach was serious enough to make military command abandon a multi-million-dollar classified operation rather than risk continued exposure. Over the following days, fragments of truth emerged through conversations among research staff who'd been present during the incident. Late at night in the recreation room, when exhausted researchers thought they were speaking privately, I heard pieces of what had really happened in the deep excavation zones. We'd opened a sealed chamber in the lower levels of the structure. One researcher said to colleagues who'd been evacuated before the breach. The interior atmosphere showed chemical composition that shouldn't have been possible after thousands of years sealed beneath the ice. Carbon dioxide and trace organic compounds suggesting recent biological activity. When we entered the chamber, we found preservation systems that were still active, another added. Temperature control mechanisms maintaining conditions warmer than surrounding excavation zones, and evidence of what Dr. Two in a time, Harriman initially thought might be mummified remains. Preserved figures arranged throughout the chamber interior, like they were positioned for some kind of ceremony. The researcher paused, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. But they weren't mummified. They were dormant. When our equipment activated certain systems in the chamber, when heat from our work lights warmed the interior atmosphere, some of them began showing signs of animation, physiological responses suggesting they weren't completely dead, just suspended in some kind of hibernation state that preserved them for geological ages. My blood ran cold listening to this. They hadn't just found architectural remains of prehistoric civilization. They had found preserved specimens of whatever species had built those structures, sealed in hibernation chambers that maintained biological functions across thousands of years, and their excavation had disturbed those preservation systems, triggering responses that shouldn't be possible for anything sealed away for so long. What made us evacuate wasn't just the signs of animation, the first researcher continued. It was what we saw in the chamber inscriptions. When Dr. Harriman managed preliminary translation of the symbols, they appeared to be warnings, instructions about how these chambers were supposed to remain sealed, how the preservation systems were designed to maintain dormancy until specific conditions were met. We weren't discovering ruins. We were breaking into sealed quarantine protocols left by whoever built this structure. Quarantine protocols, the implications were terrifying. What kind of prehistoric civilization created preservation systems designed to maintain biological specimens in suspended animation for thousands of years? And what were they trying to keep sealed away? The facility management's decision to seal the excavation sites suddenly made perfect sense. They hadn't just found evidence of unknown prehistoric civilization. They had found something that civilization had deliberately sealed and hidden. Something dangerous enough that ancient architects had built preservation systems designed to contain it until specific conditions indicated it was safe for release. And modern excavation had broken those seals, potentially releasing something that had been quarantined for reasons spanning thousands of years. The final pieces of the puzzle came during my last conversation with Beaumont before everything fell apart completely. We met in one of the few locations we'd confirmed wasn't under active surveillance, speaking quietly about what we'd learned and what it meant for everyone at Outpost Meridian. "I've been reviewing security footage from the deep excavation zones," Beaumont said. "The recordings from when research teams first entered that sealed chamber. I can't show you because the footage is classified above my clearance level, but I managed to see enough to understand why they're sealing everything." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Whatever is in those preservation chambers, it's humanoid but not human. Similar basic anatomy but with differences suggesting either parallel evolution or deliberate genetic modification. The preserved figures show anatomical variations that shouldn't exist in any known prehistoric human population, and preliminary analysis suggests they predate modern human species by timelines that don't fit any accepted model of human evolution." The implications were staggering. If what Beaumont was describing was accurate, if the preserved figures represented a prehistoric species that possessed advanced civilization before modern humans even existed, then entire fields of anthropology and archaeology would need to be rewritten from the ground up. "But that's not why they're sealing the excavation," Beaumont continued. "What concerns command authorities is the evidence that these preservation systems might have been designed for long-term containment rather than simple burial. The chamber atmospheres, the temperature controls, the structural design. Everything suggests these chambers were supposed to keep something sealed away indefinitely, and we broke those seals." I thought about the warnings researchers had mentioned, the inscriptions describing quarantine protocols, and conditions that should be met before chambers could be safely opened. Whatever prehistoric civilization had built this structure had been trying to prevent exactly what modern excavation had accomplished. "There's one more thing," Beaumont said, his voice dropping even lower. "The containment breach that triggered facility lockdown. That wasn't equipment failure or atmospheric contamination. One of the preserved figures in the chamber showed physiological responses indicating biological activity. Elevated temperature, muscle contractions, changes in cellular chemistry suggesting transition from dormancy to active state. They evacuated because something in that chamber was beginning to wake up." The final confirmation of what I'd suspected since first learning about the facility's purpose. They hadn't just found architectural ruins or preserved biological specimens, they had found something living. Something that had been sealed in hibernation for thousands of years. Something that modern excavation had begun to wake from ancient slumber. And now military command was frantically trying to seal everything back up before whatever they disturbed could fully awake. The sealing operation began within days, industrial equipment and construction materials arriving on emergency flights. To fill excavation chambers was concrete, permanently close access to underground structures. Research staff were evacuated in stages. First, those who'd had direct contact with deep excavation zones, then support personnel whose services were no longer needed for an operation being rapidly shut down. I was scheduled for evacuation during the third wave of personnel rotation, which gave me several more days at Outpost Meridian while sealing operations continued. During that time, I witnessed a systematic burial of discovery that could have revolutionized human understanding of our prehistory. Thousands of tons of concrete poured into excavation chambers, sealing away structures and preservation systems that represented capabilities far beyond anything in known human history. Military engineers worked around the clock to ensure complete closure of access points, installing permanent barriers designed to prevent future excavation attempts. And classified documentation recorded every detail of what had been discovered, ensuring that somewhere in government archives, evidence of this prehistoric civilization would be preserved, even as the physical site was buried forever. On my final night at Outpost Meridian, I stood at the facility perimeter, Looking out across the Antarctic wasteland, somewhere beneath the ice, sealed in concrete and darkness, lay evidence that human history was far stranger and more complex than official narratives suggested. Structures built by prehistoric civilization that possessed knowledge and capabilities we couldn't explain. Preservation chambers containing biological specimens that challenged our understanding of human evolution, and warnings left by ancient architects about dangers that required quarantine protocols spanning thousands of years. All of it buried again, hidden from scientific inquiry and public knowledge, classified at levels that ensured the discovery would never be shared with international research communities. The flight back to New Zealand was quiet, personnel processing what we'd witnessed in different ways. Some relieved to be leaving, grateful to return to normal military duties that didn't involve prehistoric mysteries and containment breaches. Others were angry that discovery of such magnitude was being suppressed rather than studied openly. And a few, like me, were simply trying to process the implications of what we'd learned about human prehistory and the things that might still be sealed beneath Antarctic ice. The debriefing when we returned to the United States was extensive, conducted by the same type of forgettable agency personnel who had originally briefed us on deployment. They emphasized the classified nature of everything we witnessed, the legal consequences of disclosure, the importance of maintaining operational security regarding facility activities. What you observed at Outpost Meridian represents sensitive national security information, the debriefing officer said, in the same bland bureaucratic tone I'd heard during initial briefing. The geological research conducted there has implications for territorial claims and resource development that require careful management through appropriate diplomatic channels. Your discretion regarding operational details is not just requested, it's legally required. The sanitized language couldn't disguise what they were really saying. Keep your mouth shut about what you saw, or face consequences that could destroy your military career and potentially your freedom. I signed the non-disclosure agreements because refusing wasn't really an option. But I also kept copies of documentation I'd managed to gather during my time at the facility. Inventory records showing equipment deliveries that contradicted official research purposes. Photographs of supply manifests suggesting biological containment operations. Notes on conversations I'd overheard from research staff describing discoveries that challenged official explanations. Nothing that would prove the full scope of what had been found, but enough to raise questions about what kind of operation had really been conducted at Outpost Meridian. I returned to normal military duties, assigned to logistics coordination at a base where classified operations were routine, but nowhere near the level of what I'd witnessed in Antarctica. Life continued superficially normal while I processed memories that made normal concerns feel trivial by comparison. But I never forgot what I'd seen in those deep excavation chambers. The impossible architecture of structures that predated known human civilization by thousands of years. The evidence of preservation systems maintaining biological specimens and suspended animation across geological timescales. The warnings left by prehistoric architects about dangers that required eternal containment. And most of all, I never forgot the final reports I'd read before leaving Outpost Meridian. The sealing operation hadn't been completely successful. Despite tons of concrete and permanent barriers, thermal monitoring systems installed after evacuation showed temperature anomalies in sealed excavation zones. Small variations suggesting that whatever was buried beneath all that concrete and ice wasn't completely dormant. Something was still active down there, still generating heat, still responding to the disturbance that modern excavation had caused to ancient seals. And somewhere in classified government archives, reports documented concerns that sealing operations might only delay rather than prevent whatever those prehistoric architects had been trying to contain from eventually breaking free. The warnings carved in ancient structures weren't just historical curiosities. They were prophecies, predictions about what would happen if preservation chambers were opened before specific conditions were met, conditions that modern excavation had violated, potentially triggering consequences that ancient architects had spent their entire civilization trying to prevent. I tell this story knowing it will be dismissed as fantasy or paranoid speculation by people who've never seen classified operations that officially don't exist. But I also tell it because somewhere beneath Antarctic ice, sealed in concrete and darkness, something is waiting, something that prehistoric civilization decided was too dangerous to remain free, too important to destroy, and too powerful to be allowed to wake until conditions indicated safety. And our classified excavation may have begun the process of awakening something that was never supposed to see daylight again. The containment won't hold forever. Ancient preservation systems that maintained biological functions across thousands of years. That generated heat and temperatures that should freeze anything solid. That responded to modern disturbance with signs of animation. Those systems weren't designed to fail. They were designed to wait, to maintain whatever they contained in suspended state until specific conditions were met, until the time was right for whatever had been sealed away to emerge again. We didn't discover ruins of a lost civilization. We broke into a quarantine facility, a containment system built by intelligence that understood dangers we can't even comprehend, left warnings in languages that took our best researchers weeks to partially translate, created preservation chambers that would keep something dormant until the seals were broken, and we broke those seals. Military command thinks pouring concrete over the excavation sites will keep whatever we found contained indefinitely, but the thermal readings suggest otherwise. The temperature variations in sealed zones aren't random fluctuations, they're patterns, rhythms that researchers documented before evacuation. Cycles suggesting biological processes ramping up rather than shutting down. Whatever is down there isn't going back to sleep, it's waking up, slowly, over weeks or months or years, but inevitably, because that's what the preservation systems were designed to do. Maintain dormancy until disturbance, until exposure to surface atmosphere, until conditions matched whatever parameters ancient architects programmed in the systems we barely understand. And when it fully wakes, when whatever prehistoric civilization sealed beneath Antarctic ice for thousands of years breaks through concrete barriers and frozen rock, emerges into the modern world for the first time since the last ice age, we won't be prepared. Because we've classified all knowledge of its existence, buried evidence that could have given us warning, suppressed discovery that might have helped us understand what we were dealing with. All in the name of national security and maintaining control over information that challenges official narratives about human history. I've accepted what's going to happen to me for telling this story. The non-disclosure agreements I signed, the legal consequences of revealing classified information, the military justice system that will be brought against me when authorities trace this testimony back to its source. All of it was worth it, because people deserve to know what's buried beneath Antarctic ice, what dangers our classified operations have potentially unleashed in the name of research and national security, and what might be coming when ancient seals finally fail and preservation systems complete their program cycle. Outpost Meridian is still there, abandoned but maintained by skeleton security staff who monitor sealed excavation zones, recording thermal readings that continue to show concerning patterns, documenting temperature variations that suggest increasing biological activity beneath concrete barriers. The reports go to classified archives where they're reviewed by command authorities who've decided containment is still holding, that there's no immediate threat requiring public disclosure or international cooperation. That military secrecy is more important than preparing for what might emerge when ancient containment finally fails. They're wrong. The seals are breaking, slowly but inevitably. And when they finally give way, when whatever was meant to stay sealed until specific conditions were met emerges into Antarctic daylight for the first time in thousands of years, the consequences will be beyond anything military planners anticipated, because we didn't just find evidence of prehistoric civilization. We found a warning, a quarantine, a containment facility built by intelligence that understood something we still don't, that some discoveries should remain buried, that some knowledge is too dangerous to uncover, and that some warnings left by ancient architects should be heeded rather than ignored in the name of scientific progress and classified research. The file is now closed, but the story isn't over. It's just beginning. Somewhere beneath Antarctic ice, in sealed chambers filled with concrete and darkness, ancient preservation systems continue their programmed cycle, maintaining, warming, preparing for emergence that was delayed but never prevented, for awakening that was always inevitable once seals were broken, for consequences that prehistoric architects spent their entire civilization trying to prevent, and we triggered all of it, in the name of research that officially never happened, at a facility that doesn't appear on any map conducting excavations that will never be acknowledged by authorities who've decided suppression is preferable to preparation. This is Lieutenant William Ashcroft, and this is my testimony about what really happened at Outpost Meridian. What we found beneath the ice, what we disturbed, and what might be coming when containment finally fails.